Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look at how we can add the export directive to a hot chocolate GraphQL API. Now the export directive allows us to export the results of an operation into a global variable pool that we can then reference in subsequent operations. And also, different operations in the sequence of operations can write to the same exported variable if we wish to update the value of the variable in subsequent operations, as long as the type matches. So to highlight where this can be useful, we're going to take a look at an example. Now over here on the left-hand side, I have my hot chocolate GraphQL API. I have an application DB context, which contains a table for authors and a table for books. We have an author entity, which contains an ID and a name. And we have a book entity, which contains an ID, title, and author ID. We have a one-to-many relationship between author and books. One author can author many books. In our app settings.development.json, we have a Postgres localhost connection string as our default connection. I'm using Postgres in this sample as the database provider, but feel free to use any other entity framework database provider in your project. We've then got a query class, which contains a query to get authors and get books. And we have a mutation class, which contains a mutation to add an author and a mutation to add a book. The add author mutation takes in the name of the author, and the add book mutation takes in the title of the book and the author ID of the author who authored the book. And you'll notice we're also finding the author by the author ID and making sure that the author exists in the database, or else we're throwing an argument exception saying that the author ID essentially wasn't found in the database corresponding to an author. Last but not least, in our program startup, we're adding in our application DB context. We're then registering that DB context with the GraphQL server. We're adding in both our mutation type and our query type, and we're also adding in the mutation conventions for both of our two mutations. Next up, you can see where we are mapping GraphQL. We are specifying the GraphQL server options, and we are enabling batching, because we'll be using that a little bit later on alongside our export directive, because batching and the export directive are very powerful when combined together. So we've enabled batching in our GraphQL API. Next up, if we're running in the development environment, we are seeding the database with a list of authors and a list of books to make sure that we have some data to play with in the sample. And at the bottom there, we are running the application. So that is our super simple GraphQL API with a couple of mutations and a couple of queries. And what we're going to do now is we're going to build and run the API. Just give it a few seconds there to spin up. And now if we pop over here into Postman, I'm going to refetch the schema. And what we are going to do is we are going to write a couple of mutations. Now let's say that we want to add an author and then add a book for that author. Now you know we have two mutations, one to add author and one to add book, so it's fairly self-explanatory. We just need a mutation to add an author and then a mutation to add a book. So let's look at doing that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a mutation. We're going to call it add author, and we're going to provide the author name as an input. Next up, we're going to call that add author mutation from our GraphQL API. This takes in an input parameter, and the input object contains a name property, and we'll reference the name variable like so. And then in the payload, we're going to return the ID of the author, like so. If we pop over here to our GraphQL variables, like so, we're going to specify the name, and the name, for the purposes of this sample, I'm just going to use Aaron Clark, like so. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send that mutation request into the GraphQL API, and you see that we get back the ID of that author. We can validate that that was created in the database. If we open up the database tab over here on the right, and if we take a look in the authors table, you can see we have the author Aaron Clark, and we have the ID starting 5 Delta 0 Alpha, which matches the ID here in our response from the GraphQL API. So what we can do now is we can make a note of that ID, copy it to the clipboard, and then we're going to run a second mutation to add a book for that author. So what I'm going to do there is say add book instead of add author. I'm going to change the variable to title, and then I'm also going to add in another input for the author ID, like so, and that's going to be type UID. And then we'll change this to reference the add book mutation, and then the input is going to take in the title, like so, and then it's also going to take in the author ID, like so. And then we can change the response type of the payload to return us the ID of the book. Last but not least, we can come over here to our GraphQL variables, and I'm just going to specify the title of the book as Hello World. And we're also going to need to specify that author ID input that we defined on the add book mutation. And that's going to be the ID that we got back from our add author mutation. So if we now send that request in, you can see that we have our book with an ID of Bravo Charlie Charlie Delta. If we take a look in the books table, you can see we have a book Hello World with ID Bravo Charlie Charlie Delta, and the author ID 5 Delta 0 Alpha, which corresponds with the author Aaron Clark 5 Delta 0 Alpha. Now that's all well and good. We've created an author, and then we've created a book that is authored by that author. But notice how we had to do that using two separate network requests into the GraphQL API. And that's because the add book mutation requires the author ID, but we won't know the ID of the author until the author is created and we get the ID returned in the response. Now this is where the export directive comes into play, because when combined with request batching in our GraphQL API, we can assign the author ID in the response to a variable, and then in the add book mutation we can use that exported author ID as an input when we add the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear these out like so, and I'm going to change from GraphQL to raw, and as we can see over here we have two requests that are batched together using our request batching functionality. You recall we enabled batching in our GraphQL server options. And what I'm going to do now is just go over these two queries and explain a little bit about what they are doing and how it's different from sending two distinct network requests. So what you'll notice here inside the first request is that we have this mutation, add author, with a variable name, which is type string. You can see then we have our add author with the input, and we pass in the name as the input to the add author mutation. And notice how we then have the author in the payload, and we have the ID of the author exactly the same as before. However, we now have this export directive. And what this is basically saying is, take the ID of the author that is created in the mutation and store it in a variable called author ID. Now this variable is then accessible in subsequent requests in our batching. So what we can then do is we can have our second mutation to add book. This simply takes in a title as an input variable. We then have our add book mutation, and we have our input, and you'll notice that we're specifying the title matching the input for the add book mutation and the title variable, but then notice we're also specifying the author ID. However, you'll note that the author ID is not included in the inputs to the add book mutation. You'll notice that there we only have the title variable defined. We don't define a variable for author ID. And that's because the hot chocolate GraphQL context will essentially pick up the author ID from the global variable pool. You'll recall we exported our author ID as author ID, and so we can simply reference the variable author ID in order to pick up the ID of the author. So this means that we can send those two mutations in a single network request. So instead of sending in two requests, we can just send in one request. And all that we need to do to allow that to happen is inside our program startup, we have our call to add GraphQL server. And all we need to do is say add export directive type, like so. And that will register the export directive with the GraphQL server. What I'm going to do is just stop and rerun the API in order to pick up that added directive type, like so. And what we can do now, if we go back over into Postman, is we can run this GraphQL request. So what I'll do is I will send this request, like so. And you'll notice, if you recall from our video about enabling batching, we now have a multi-part mixed response type as our response from the GraphQL API. You'll notice that our first response is the call to add author, the add author mutation, and it returns an author ID of Bravo Bravo 3 Echo. The author's name is Thomas Clark. So if we take a look back in our authors table, like so, you'll see we have an author Thomas Clark with the ID Bravo Bravo 3 Echo. That matches the ID that was returned from the add author mutation, so we know that that has worked correctly. And we then have our second response in the multi-part response body, which is our add book mutation. We can see that it's added a book called Hello World, based on the title in the input variable Hello World. And the ID of the book is Charlie 601. So if we take a look in the books table, you'll notice that we have a second book called Hello World with the ID Charlie 601, and the author ID is Bravo Bravo 3 Echo, and that corresponds with the ID of the author Thomas Clark. And you'll notice how we didn't need to specify the author ID in the variables in the add book mutation. It was automatically inferred by the fact that we exported the ID of the author from the first request as author ID. Now you may recall from our video about enabling batching in a GraphQL API that each of the requests is executed in the order that they are specified. So it will execute the add author mutation first, which will expose the author ID variable in the global variable pool. And then it will execute the add book mutation second, because it's second in order in our list. It's important that, of course, you have these the correct way around. If you executed the add book mutation first, then the author ID variable would not be exported and would not be available in the global variable pool if that was being executed after the add book mutation. But as we're executing add author first, we have that author ID variable available for any and all subsequent requests or operations in the GraphQL API network request. Now you'll notice that we are specifying this as option with the value author ID, and that's because by default the ID is just exported as ID. So this as option allows you to provide an alias for the exported variable. So if we simply specified export like so, then that would mean that we would have a global variable in the pool just called ID. And we could reference it like so by specifying author ID of just ID. However, if you subsequently exported another ID, it would overwrite the ID variable that was exported from add author. And that's because you can write to the same exported variable multiple times in subsequent requests, as long as the type of the variable matches. So if we had a subsequent request to add some other type and we exported a field called ID and it was the same type as the author ID, then it would overwrite the first exported ID because it would have the same name. So specifying as author ID allows us to alias the ID field so that it's actually stored as a variable called author ID, which makes it explicit that this is the ID of the author and not some other ID that might potentially be exported later on in a subsequent request in the batching operations. Also, exporting is not limited to scalar types. In this instance, we're exporting the author ID, which is just a simple UID or GUID. You can also export entire objects. So we could move the export directive from ID to author, for example, and that would export the entire author object into a variable called author. And you could then subsequently use that variable as an input for future mutations, or indeed use it as a filter on subsequent queries, or any other operation that takes some form of input, whether it's a sort, a filter, or indeed a mutation itself. So that's the export directive. You're not limited to simply relying on using the export directive with scalar types. You can use it with more complex object types with nested fields and properties. And that then adds that variable into a global variable pool that can be referenced in subsequent operations or documents in a single GraphQL request. So this video essentially has shown you how you can add the export directive straightforwardly in the program startup in the call to add GraphQL server, adding in the export directive type. And I've then shown you how you can combine two distinct requests, one to add author, retrieving the ID, and then one to add book using the author ID that was retrieved from the first request. We've combined those two individual requests into a single network request, and we've assigned the author ID to the exported global variable called author ID, and we've then subsequently used that author ID as an input for a subsequent GraphQL request, in our case to add a book using the exported author ID as the input for the book's author ID. So the export directive, when combined with batching, is, as I say, very powerful and allows you to significantly improve the performance of both the GraphQL API and more so consumers of the API, because they will be able to reduce the number of distinct requests that they are sending over the network into the GraphQL API by combining multiple requests together using the batching functionality and also using the export directive, as we've shown in this example, to export an ID to use in a subsequent mutation. So I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.